welcome to our very first episode of Psychology and Christ Enabling. I'm Nada, a psychology undergraduate student.
And I'm Julie, I'm a PhD candidate in psychology.
In this episode, we'll be covering the mental health basics. Let's jump right in. So Julie, what is mental health?
So mental health is actually the same as our physical health. It's just related to everything that we feel, that we think, and what we do. So everything related to our emotions, our thoughts, and our behavior, that's mental health. And so there's a big misconception that mental health is actually mental illness, and that's a totally different thing. And so everyone actually has a mental health.
So your mind, body, and soul actually combine to form your well-being. This means that both your social and physical, as well as mental, all influence each other to form your mental health.
Yeah, exactly. So actually the absence of an illness doesn't dictate someone's health. So for example, when it comes to physical health, if we don't have a physical illness, it doesn't mean that we're physically healthy. That's actually determined by our everyday habits. So the eating, if we're sleeping, if we're getting enough movement. And it's exactly the same thing when it comes to our mental health. It's not because we don't have a mental illness that we're not gonna struggle with our mental health.
So Julie, what influences mental health?
There are different things that can impact our mental health. And it doesn't mean that it's gonna impact our mental illness. It's just an overall, whether in a good way or in a bad way, it's going to impact our mental health. So the first thing is genetics. So for example, if we have someone in our family who has a history of a mental illness, this could impact our mental health or even contribute to the fact that we develop a mental illness. The second thing is our identity. So we actually live through our identity. So if we're part of a minority group, and so we're always trying to explain why we do things, this could actually impact our mental health because the majority doesn't understand our reality. The third thing is our direct environment. So here we're talking about our personal story. So if we've been through trauma, if we've had a history of bullying, if we live in a healthy environment at home or an unhealthy one, and even our friendships could impact our mental health.
And throughout Scripture, God warns us multiple times to wisely choose our environments, knowing how much that this impacts us.
Yes, exactly. And the last thing is our society and the culture that we live in. So that means, is there a lot of stigma surrounding mental health? Is it easy for us to go and access help when it comes to our mental health? And so this is going to either impact it positively or negatively.
So can you explain the mental health spectrum?
Yeah. So mental health actually lies on a spectrum. So it goes from healthy to in a reaction or stress, to struggling, to in a crisis. And that spectrum, we can all navigate on it, whether we have a mental illness or not. And actually, it's the exact same spectrum when it comes to our physical health. So I'm going to explain it giving various examples with our physical health. So to start off, being healthy with our physical health is just, feeling great, eating well, getting some movement in, everything's going well. Being healthy when it comes to our mental health is basically just feeling good. Nothing particularly is happening. We feel in control. Back to our physical health. So if we're a little bit stressed, that would mean maybe that we have a headache or we're lacking a little bit of sleep. So here what we can do is just maybe take a painkiller or just get an extra hour of sleep, and then we'll be able to go back to the healthy part of the spectrum. It's the same thing with our mental health. So maybe we have an exam coming up or an important meeting. So we're feeling a little bit stressed. Something is happening in our life in which we are reacting. So we are in reaction to something. And so what we can do here is different things. Maybe talk to a friend to get some extra support. Maybe it's to prep a little extra for that meeting or that exam. But we are in control. We can still do stuff to get back to the healthy part of the spectrum. So now onto the struggling part of our physical health. That means maybe we have a bone fracture. So if we have a bone fracture, we're not gonna try and treat ourselves at home, for example. We're gonna go and see a doctor, get an x-ray, just to make sure that we're getting our bone fracture fixed. So it's the same thing with our mental health. So struggling with our mental health, maybe that means that we haven't been ourselves lately. So maybe we've been feeling down for a little while. Maybe we're not eating well, we're having trouble focusing. Our grades at school are not great anymore, and it's not the usual thing that we're used to. And so that means that we actually need to go seek out for professional help.
There's no shame in getting help. In fact, God loves us so much that He surrounds you with all these resources so you can go and get the right kind of help. Oftentimes, when we reach out to an adult in church, they might tell us to pray. Of course, prayer is important, but in Proverbs chapter 3, God tells us not to lean on our own understanding. The fight is not for us to do alone. He surrounds you with all these resources. Go, get the help that you need.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we might even end up in a crisis, and so this is the end of the mental health spectrum. So going back to our physical health spectrum, a crisis would look like maybe we've had a car accident and we're unconscious. Obviously, no one's going to question whether or not you need to go to the ER. And so it's the same thing with our mental health. If there is a risk of harming ourselves or harming other people, it's absolutely important to go to the emergency or call 911.
So what's a mental health struggle?
So going back to our mental health definition, which is everything that we feel, that we think, and what we do, the first cue is directly related to those three areas. So we want to look for changes in them. So changes in how we feel. So maybe we're feeling intense feelings of anger or intense sadness, or maybe it could be an intense high if that's not in our nature. Another change could be in how we think. So maybe for other people, we can't know what they're thinking, but we can know through what they're saying. So if they're saying stuff like, I don't care, people don't care about me, these are all signs that we could look for. And the last thing is changes in the things that we do. So if, for example, we're used to going to our basketball practice and we stop doing that, if we have trouble concentrating, or maybe it's in the opposite of our nature to go and talk to everyone, and we're doing that right now, these changes maybe could be a sign of us struggling. So the second cue is that it's going to be something that's going to be long lasting. So it's not just going to be for a few days. It might be weeks or months. So after 2 weeks, if we see that we're still not the same, we're feeling a little bit off, then it's a good sign to go and seek out for professional help. The third sign is that it's going to have a big impact on our lives. It's going to have big dysfunctions in our lives. So maybe our grades go down, or our performance at work is not good, or our relationships are struggling. So these are all signs that we might be struggling with our mental health. Just to recap, basically these signs are just guidelines. We don't need them all. They're just here as hints to tell us that this is not just the normal up and down of life, that we're actually might be struggling with our mental health. And again, this doesn't mean necessarily that we have a mental illness, but that we're just struggling with our mental health, and it's still valid to go and seek out for help.
As Christians, we're called to love one another. Part of this love is caring. And to care, it's important that we notice these kind of changes in each other. Then we could see if someone is really struggling and see if we can give them the adequate help they need. If you're struggling with something, maybe talk to a priest about it. Perhaps the most that they'll tell you to do is to pray. Unfortunately, many of us are not fully equipped to be able to help somebody who's struggling with their mental health. So we as Christians need to keep praying for each other and encourage each other to go see the adequate resources. So what's a mental illness?
So mental illness comes up when we talk about mental health, but let's remember that mental illness is not mental health. Mental illness is actually when you have specific symptoms, you put them together, you have a specific mental illness. So for example, you have a bunch of symptoms, you put them together, you get anorexia. You have other symptoms together, then you have clinical depression. And so mental illness doesn't actually dictate whether or not you're going to be mentally healthy. For example, if someone has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, it doesn't mean that they're going to be mentally unhealthy or always in a crisis, if we remember our mental health spectrum. And so if that person is taking their medication, they're seeing their psychiatrist, they might actually live a very healthy life. And it's the same thing for us. If we ever struggle with our mental health, it doesn't mean that we have a mental illness. Maybe something specifically happens in our life, like we hear about the loss of someone who is dear to us. Maybe that could send us to a struggling point or even a crisis point. But it doesn't mean that we have a mental illness.
Difficulties are inevitable in life. Sometimes it's a mental health struggle, sometimes it's a mental illness. But regardless, we have a very loving Father, a very loving God who promises for us hope and a future.
So to summarize, we all have mental health, and mental health is on a spectrum. It goes from healthy to in a reaction to struggling to crisis. And so mental health is different from a mental illness. And it's not because we don't have a mental illness that we can't struggle with our mental health.
And that concludes our first episode. So I'll leave you with this. In Psalm 94, it reads, "In the multitude of my anxieties, your comfort delights my soul."